welcome. We have with us today Peter Hessler, staff writer for The New Yorker, who is here to talk with us about his new book, Other Rivers, detailing 2 years that he spent in Sichuan from 2019 to 2021. Peter Hessler has been staff writer for The New Yorker since the early 2000s.
Yeah, since 2000.
He has written now 5 books on China and one from Egypt, where he was posted from 2011 to 2016. He first went to China in 1996 as a Peace Corps teacher and stayed there until 2007, returning in 2019 for this second stint. This book has just been published, and we're delighted to welcome him in the New York offices of Asia Society to chat with us about it. So, Peter, congratulations on your book. It's a terrific read. I burned right through it. You have such a unique style. It's always a very recognizable sort of quiver of writer's tricks that you have,
Okay.
which makes it very readable. This book is being called elsewhere a bit of a sequel to Rivertown, your first book, which I believe came out in 99?
2001.
2001,
Yeah.
a bit about your experiences in Fuling, Chongqing, from 97 to 99. Do you think that that term is fair? Do you think of it as a sequel that has so much else in it, which has nothing to do with the students from Fuling? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's fine to call it a sequel. I mean, I sort of conceived it as such in the sense that a few years after I finished Rivertown, I was already in touch with these students that I taught there, and I was returning to the place periodically, and I just had this idea it would be interesting to go back and teach and write about this area and about these people again. So that's kind of the way I conceived it. It did expand. I ended up teaching in a different place, not in Fuling. I taught at Sichuan University instead, so I had sort of a new generation of students that I was working with. And of course, other things happen that you don't plan on, like by the time I moved back, I had children who were in the school, so that's something that wasn't part of Rivertown. And of course, the pandemic happened while we were there, and so some of the book describes those events as well.
So 22 years have passed since that first book and this fifth one from China. And also there was that period of 12 years where you weren't in China from 2007 to 2019. You use this refrain in the book, everything has changed, nothing has changed. Both personally, as someone interested in China who went back after this hiatus, and as a writer observing with that lens, what changed, what didn't?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there were incredible changes in terms of the material conditions and material situation. I mean, when I was in Fuling in 1996, it was a pretty poor provincial city. It was on the Yangtze River. There were no highways. There were no railroads. It felt very isolated. If you went to Chongqing was the nearest big city, and that took 8 hours on the boat if you went there. And most of us didn't go there very much, and people didn't travel much. Almost all of my students in that generation were from the countryside. They were from farm families, very, low-level subsistence farming, often family with half an acre of land, and many of them had known pretty serious poverty, and generally from families that had no educational tradition or background. So parents who were illiterate, they were often the first people from their villages to go to university. Probably more, I think it was more than 90% of my students were from the countryside. So, that was sort of the China we lived in from 96, 98. You could see that things were changing, and the fact that these kids were in my classroom was part of the change. I mean, China was in the process of expanding higher education, and my students were being trained to teach English because they wanted them to go back to kind of rural or semi-rural schools to teach the next generation of kids so they could expand English instruction. So you could get a sense that things were moving, but we didn't really envision how quickly things would change. I mean, actually, even before Rivertown came out, before it was published, certain descriptions, even on page 1, were obsolete. Like I said, there's no railroad, there's no highway. By that time, they had finished the first railroad, and the highway was almost done. And there were others to follow. And eventually, that 8-hour trip got cut down to 38 minutes on a high-speed train. And those kind of changes are unbelievable, right?
And that's the trouble of writing any China book, that in between filing the manuscript and it coming out, China's changed all over again. So, let alone a gap of 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, especially in that era. I mean, right, this was kind of the big, I think in some ways, the biggest material change was that period, late 90s or 2000s, was when things were really just accelerating. So, yeah, it changed on a scale that we hadn't expected. But at the same time, like so many qualities of the place and of the people are very recognizable. And those changes, of course, educational changes that I'm describing, the expansion of higher education, improvements in education, and also the material change, people's living standards improving, transportation improving. But the same party's in charge, the same political system, and in some ways it was even more restrictive in 2019 than it was when I left in 1998. So I think that kind of contrast is something you wrestle with as an outsider. Is how is it possible to have all of this change in these aspects of society, but not to have any sort of significant political change?
What was the aspect of society where change surprised you the most, or something materially in the nation, or just the way things looked or people talked?
Yeah, I mean, really all those things you mentioned, and you say the way people talk, it is true. Like when we were there, it was often hard to communicate because people were dialect speakers. And they used to have signs all over the campus, 请说普通话. They were reminding people to speak Mandarin. And actually, the English department was notorious for having instructors who couldn't speak Mandarin, even though they were teaching English. And because of all the travel, because of migration, because of television, nowadays anywhere you go in China, people basically speak pretty good Mandarin, except for maybe some of the older people. Certainly in cities, right, and especially young people. So even at that level, you're seeing this kind of change. But I think especially where it hits you the most when you're with us is this cohort of people that I taught who had pretty marginal economic backgrounds when they arrived, and some of them had dealt with serious poverty. I mean, I have a student who wrote me 20 years later and said, "I'm sorry I was such a bad student in your class." And I kind of remembered he wasn't a bad kid. He was kind of sleepy, low energy. And he's like, for 2 years I couldn't eat. I ate one meal a day, and you realize that the kid was hungry, right? And he was malnourished and suffering. And so a lot of those details you actually didn't learn until later, because of course they weren't going to tell you those sort of things. But pretty much all of those people entered the middle class. They have apartments, they have cars, they live a very comfortable life. In that regard, and that I didn't realize how much across the board that change would be. When we taught them, I wouldn't have expected those sort of change, especially things like automobiles. I mean, when I was teaching there in the 90s, I didn't know anybody who had a car, a private car. And then by the time I go back, I actually don't know anybody who doesn't.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, from my early trips in China in sort of kind of 2007 and 8, you'd go to these different cities and corners or Xinjiang, and it would really everywhere would feel very different. And I kind of noticed in the last few years that I was there that you would go to these cities, and wherever you are, it felt the same. You would see the same sort of signs, even in the far west of the country and so on. And the city centers would have the same sort of shops and so on. So with that sort of, with China becoming richer, I feel like it's become more standardized as well. And some of that kind of local or rural flavor is hard to come by.
Yeah, and same with language. Of course, the language becomes standardized.
So you mentioned your students. Education is sort of the through line of this book. And you've often paired your writing work with teaching work. And we'll get into the students in a second. But do you think that education and writing go together? Many teachers have been writers and vice versa. And why do you choose education as a lens through which to tell us about the China of today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, it happened to be the way I arrived, right? I first traveled through China just as a tourist in 1994 after finishing my graduate school at Oxford, and that was part of a long trip, and I went through China, but something about it kind of captured my attention and my imagination, and I thought this would be a good place to live. And then when I looked into going back, teaching was a good way to do it, and the Peace Corps had just started a program there. So, in the 90s, if you didn't have a China background and didn't speak Chinese, teaching was one way to just go and you're there, and it's actually a really good, I think it's such a good window into Chinese society because, it's so important to Chinese culture, and their relation to education, I think, is somewhat unique. And so as a teacher, you're in a danwei, you've got a work unit, you're part of the system, which in some ways is a good way to learn, and you've got a group of students and a clear task. So it was a really good way to arrive, and then that just kind of became my foundation. And when I ended up writing about that experience, of course, I described the teaching. But I stayed close to education because almost everybody I taught, the overwhelming majority became teachers, which is what they were being trained to do. There were some who went into the private entrepreneur, and I spent a lot of time with them as well, but most of them became teachers. And so over the years, I would hear about their classes. I would visit their classes when I was traveling through their areas. So I maintained this contact with Chinese education, even though I never taught again until 2019. So it was always part of what I was interested in, and I liked the idea of going back and teaching again. I mean, as a journalist, there's a lot of great things of being a journalist, and that the kind of distance you have, is often very healthy. But there are sometimes there are points where I feel like I'd like to be a little more connected, or I think you get a different perspective when you're in and part of something,
Right.
And there is that separation can be problematic sometimes. And so I think after so many years of working as a journalist, I was ready to sort of be doing something a little different. And teaching is probably the only thing I can do that allows me to do that.
Participating instead of just observing. And you're also working with young people, which is such a great sort of way into where China is today and in the future, just like archaeology has also been another sort of in for you in observing the past.
Yeah, I mean, as you get older, it's harder to have contact with young people. If you're a journalist, I mean, you can search them out and interview, but it's not always that natural. This was a natural way. And it's interesting, because when I first taught there, I was not much older than those students. I was 27 years old. A lot of them were 23 or so. They were a little older than a lot of Chinese university students. And then going back, I'm kind of the age of their parents, basically, when I'm teaching this at Sichuan University. And so it's, it's a different relationship. I have a different, sort of stature as an older teacher, and you're feeling all of the ways in which this has changed.
So to talk about your peers who you were teaching in the late 90s in Fuling and Chongqing as a Peace Corps teacher, Peace Corps volunteer, you go back in order to catch up with them. You've kept in touch with them over the years, digitally and so on. Presumably had the intention in this book to tell their stories as well as your current students. Fuling is, as I understand it, partly underwater from the Three Gorges Dam, but the old campus was still there. You visited it and so on. And you meet up with your former students. As you say, many are teachers, some middle management, one runs an elevator company. What surprised you about their trajectories, and what do you think that their journeys that they've been on over the last 22 years tells you about?
Yeah, I mean, some of the ones that didn't go into teaching, I think, have had the most surprising paths, right? So there was one I described in this book named Youngsi, who started out as a teacher, and like most of the others, he was from a very marginal background, had no special, advantages. He wasn't actually a particularly great student. He was perfectly fine, but a nice kid, and like a very charismatic. He was a very nice looking, very handsome kid, kind of stood out by his looks, and he was fun to talk to and hang out with. And so he was a teacher. And then while in his early years teaching, I think he just had an entrepreneurial spirit. He had this idea, let's start a private class for typing, because kids are hearing about computers. And so, he bought two little, very inexpensive keyboards, and the kids would line up. He'd do this after hours using his classroom in the school, and kids would pay like 2 kwai, I think it was, about 25 cents. And they'd line up, and he had a little alarm, and they'd type for 2 minutes, practicing with him giving instruction. Then he'd hit the alarm, and the next kid would come in, and they'd just do it on a cycle. And he set up this course, which is kind of what became known as buxi, but this is sort of before, the supplemental courses that became such a big part of the Chinese childhood nowadays. This is when it was pretty early, but parents were starting to have some disposable income. They were starting to think about ways to give their kid an advantage. And they subscribed to the class. It became popular. And pretty soon he was making more money from that than he was from his teaching. The school didn't know what to do about that initially, and they shut it down. But then somebody's like, well, actually, this is what Deng Xiaoping wants us to do. Like, we're supposed to be encouraging. And so they let him do it. And he made some money. He was able to transfer job to go to Fuling, which was the nearest big city. He borrowed some money from somebody, and he set up a little cell phone shop. And, as part of, along with the cell phone, some supplier stocked him with some walkie-talkies, which he wasn't very interested in, because he thought that people would want cell phones. People were just starting to get them now. This would have been like 98, 99. But he realized pretty quickly that the walkie-talkies were selling like crazy. And it was because construction companies would use them on site because construction workers in those days didn't have phones. You want your workers to have walkie-talkies, and as you expand, you buy more walkie-talkies. You got to get the same frequency. You're going to go to the same shop, and so he had kind of had this niche that he stumbled onto. And he ended up opening another shop and then another one, and he just dominated this market, and he just became fabulously wealthy. And one thing led to another, and he became sort of a tycoon with real estate companies. He would he'd build parking garages and alarm systems and security systems, all the things that you need in a new urban landscape, and none of which he had been trained for. I mean, this was a kid who was trained to be a teacher, right. And became. I mean, so when I went back to fooling with him, he was driving around in a S-Class Mercedes that was $150,000. I mean, this sort of wealth that I would never have imagined. And that kid, who wasn't like one of my top students, I wouldn't say, yeah, that guy's going to be fabulously wealthy in 20 years. So some of these stories are just unbelievable, and they're right place, right time, but they didn't have any advantages. I mean, he didn't have any family that was helping him do this. His parents couldn't read.
I mean, like you say in the book, it's sort of emblematic of that generation born in the 70s who were there when the pie was still being divided up in China, and there were these opportunities to be an entrepreneur and to corner a new market. I also love the story of North, the elevator company guy, because it's such a perfect symbolism for China's upwards ambitions. I love that they play Kenny G going home to welcome people back to their apartments. I remember that. That's also how they'd get you out of a supermarket at closing. But it strikes me that the next generations come along, like my generation, born in the 80s, the Balingho as they were called, and even more so the generation of kids that you were teaching at Sichuan University. For them, the pie had already been divided up, and there's more discussion of social inequity, lack of opportunity, these movements that you get into of involution and lying flat and so on. So can you tell us a little bit about the contrast with your students at Sichuan University and how they were different in their ambitions and opportunities and personalities to those at Fulham?
Yeah. I mean, completely different. And starting from the numbers in their families, right? I mean, they were almost all only children. More than 90% of them were only children. Whereas the Fuling generation, those were from pretty big farm families. It was not uncommon for people to have come from a family of 4 kids, and it was very rare. Actually, I think my last semester I did a survey, and only one kid in the class out of about 17 or 18 was an only child. So that was a big difference. Also, almost nobody from the countryside. The first semester I taught at Sichuan University, I didn't have one student from a rural area. I mean, a couple of them had lived in rural areas when they were young, like with grandparents briefly, but wasn't really their hometown. They'd gone to high schools in the cities. In the semesters my other semesters, I occasionally had 1 or 2 students from the countryside, but almost nobody. So these were generally urban residents, and almost all of them were middle class. Some of them were quite well off. The parents had been successful as entrepreneurs, but they were generally middle class. But yeah, the sense of promise was very different. In that the world was not nearly as open. One of the things even in Rivertown, when I described that cohort of students in the 90s, I talked about how they often seemed young. They seemed kind of childlike and naive. And, Adam and I, the other teacher, Adam and I always had to kind of remind ourselves, like, don't condescend to them. Don't look down on them. Like they've seen stuff that we've never seen. They've experienced challenges that would intimidate us. But they seemed young, partly because they were coming into a new world. This was a new environment. They had no background in their villages or their families for college, and living in a city. By the time I was teaching at Sichuan University, the students struck me in the exact opposite way, in that they seemed old. They seemed kind of, I describe them as old souls, in the sense that not particularly idealistic. Very realistic, very practical, understanding how the system worked, understanding the benefits, but also the flaws, because their parents were already city people, and their parents were already in the middle class. And so they were quite aware, and they were pretty well informed as well. Whereas the students of the 90s, many basic things they didn't know about. Like none of them would have known anything about what happened in Tiananmen Square in 1989. The kids in Sichuan University, they knew stuff. They had access to VPNs. They would fanchang, go over the wall. The internet restrictions. At the same time, like, I wouldn't describe them as like jaded or they were very likable. Like, I've had a great deal of sympathy for them. but it's not the same. They did not have the feeling of entering the same wide open world that those kids were entering in the 90s.
I mean, that's a way you could describe Gen Z anywhere in the world, sort of plugged in, some material basis of comfort, but also quite jaded.
And it is useful to remember that. I mean, whereas China is quite unique, some of these things are universal. And the same thing with it's kind of seeing the system trend toward authoritarianism. We've seen this in a lot of other places during this moment, right? So China is not just off on its own doing something different, right? And so I think that's true. A lot of people in many countries around the world young people, they feel more pressure than they did in the past. They feel less promise, less opportunity. And the Chinese students also, I think, shared that quality, but for their own reasons and in their own way.
Let's talk about that politics you alluded to, because it is a different political situation in China that you were going back to. It's difficult to compare really the kind of late 90s to the early 2020s in terms of where China is politically. I mean, you mentioned this. You talk about how you were denied a teaching position in Chongqing because of the Boursier affair and sensitivities there. You talk of this feeling in the air that Xi Jinping is, quote, a new type of God after Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. But you also talk about how you saw little evidence of increased nationalism among your students. And sometimes I feel like politics just sucks up all the space in conversations about China or perceptions about China in the West. What was your most kind of clear-headed view of how politics have changed and what we get out of proportion?
Yeah, I mean, the nature of the leader had obviously changed, right? In that when I was in Fuling, people talked about the leaders a lot. They talked about Mao and Deng a lot. Deng was still alive when I started teaching in Fuling. He died toward the end of my first year. And he, of course, he was from Sichuan, and he had initiated the changes that were already starting to change places like Fuling, and that would really shape the lives of my students. So he was a topic of conversation and of essays, and they would mention him, refer to him constantly. Mao as well. The leader at that time was Jiang Zemin, who was not somebody they talked about all the time, and he wasn't one of these kind of godlike figures. I think in many ways he was a good leader, and he actually gave a lot of support to education. Something that he ended up having a real impact on. He was kind of critical to this expansion of higher education. But he wasn't one of these people, he wasn't at all like a Mao figure or a Deng figure. He served 2 terms and left, and Hu Jintao came in and served 2 terms later. So that, you kind of felt like at that time you're no longer in this kind of authoritarian system with the charismatic leader. And even if these guys were the premiers, there was always a feeling that decision making was much more collaborative under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. It wasn't so much like one guy just calling the shots. And we don't know for sure, but pretty good information is probably the way it was working.
They called them technocrats, right?
Yeah. And so anyway, that was the climate then, and Xi Jinping is like totally different, right? And so he's somebody who comes in 2012, eventually has the constitution changed so that he can stay in power indefinitely. It's a bit, major change. And also just the level of power, level of influence. I mean, of course, the first thing he did that people really noticed was the anti-corruption campaigns. And that was something that really appealed to people in these areas. And so my students initially were my Fuling students were very positive about him when I would do surveys with them, like in 2015, 2016, because they felt like he had solved some of these local corruption problems or ended some of these, blatant misuse of funds that they would see all the time. And they felt like the government was functioning better because people were afraid. But I noticed as a teacher, the name never came up in class. Like I couldn't actually remember, students did not refer to him. It wasn't like the old days when they referred to, students sometimes would still refer to Deng and Mao, but not very often.
But Xi Jinping was a presence?
Xi Jinping was a presence through absence.
Yeah.
They didn't want to talk about it.
Okay.
They were hearing enough. And it's a risk, right? If you bring up his name and it's brought up in the wrong way, somebody could report you. This happens in Chinese universities, and I could tell they just wanted to avoid it. They wanted to avoid this subject. And when I talked to some of the ones I got to know well when we were talking private about this, they're just like, I don't want to think about it. I don't want to think about him. And I could tell that figure didn't grab them, actually. There wasn't much of a connection with the young. I think there's fear, but not affection. Certainly not worship. And there was I had a strong feeling of generally a desire to be disengaged from politics, right? Whereas when fooling, the other thing that you really noticed was the kids that you really liked, that you know, the ones who stood out, who were like very charismatic and outgoing, and you connected with early, you quickly realized they were already in the party. The party had targeted them early. You realized this kid's smart, he's got talent. Some of them were good students, but often they were just like really charismatic, like North, that kid you mentioned who started the elevator company. The party had grabbed him because he was very responsible, he was well liked, just a real solid kid. And he became a party member. He really didn't care very much about politics, you know. But whereas at Sichuan University, that type of kid almost never was a party member when I got to know them.
Right.
And I was less aware of the party members at Sichuan University, and interesting enough. I knew a lot more about other aspects of students' lives, whereas in Fuling, you knew kind of who all the party members were, because kids talked about it. It was a big deal. Like, it was an honor, and people wanted to do it. And Sichuan University, they just didn't want to deal with it, and the best students didn't tend to join. And that's, obviously, this is what I'm observing in a very small, you know, subset, but it's been observed in national surveys. Like, if you look at Li Chunling, who's done a lot, sociologist, who's done
China's youth, right?
Yeah, so she's done a lot of surveys, and she has tracked that. Like, among elite, highly educated young Chinese, there was reduced interest in joining the party.
But still, the numbers have gone up on average every year on year, and at an elite university, it would be assumed that the best students would be party members, even if it's just for their CV. I'm surprised that they weren't in China.
Yeah, there weren't as many that because I checked with a lot of the best students, and they weren't. Some of them had been approached and had explained that they weren't interested. Which didn't happen in Fuling. There were a couple of them in Fuling that I knew, but that was rare, to have the party interested in you and you weren't interested in the party.
So you talk about this dampening effect and a lack of interest in politics, people being more clued into international news, less nationalistic pacts that you might expect, but you also had encounters with politics and nationalism yourself. You talk about the incident of, John, where the Jubao incident, where someone reported you for comments that you'd written editing one of their essays, and presumably some of the content of the class as well. How did that experience did you expect it? How did it change your feelings about the college and the students and the work? Do you think it was an outlier? How did you come to process that?
Yeah, in general, the politics was less apparent in the classroom than I remembered from the 90s. Like, in the 90s, there was definitely... you definitely felt lines that you weren't supposed to cross. And it wasn't because anybody told you the lines. It's because, if you talked about certain things in certain ways, the students would react immediately. And they would get very quiet, and the heads would drop. And you'd kind of look out, and it was a terrible feeling. And I describe in the book, like, your heart would race, you'd get hot, you just know you've screwed up somehow. And it could be something like, it could be just any kind of cultural faux pas, but politically it could be something like just referring to the Opium Wars in a certain way, or Hong Kong, or just certain like small things, could trigger this kind of reaction. And it was especially that first semester, because I didn't really know a lot of the lines, right? And that was not happening at Sichuan University, but it's partly because the students were savvier. They knew how to control. Like I describe in the book, there was a time when Leslie came in and talked. And, my wife, Leslie, who's Chinese American, was born in the United States, but her family had, fled the mainland to Taiwan after the revolution, 1949. And at one point in her talk, she said China and Taiwan. And it's probably because she was using English, because if you were in Chinese, you'd say Daodu, that's what you would do. You could say you can say Taiwan in the mainland.
But,
Yeah, but you could say Taiwan in the mainland, nobody's gonna, but if you say Taiwan and China, then it sort of assumes that they're separate countries. And this was such a small thing that neither of us noticed. But one of the students was about to raise her hand and say something, and then another student later told me she kind of communicated. And the student said, "What should we say?" And she kind of communicated, "No, just don't do it." And so there was all this stuff went on in the classroom, and neither Leslie nor I noticed it. And we're pretty attuned, right? This was a group I'd been teaching at that point for maybe 5-6 weeks, so I kind of knew them. We'd both been in China a long time, but we didn't notice that, right? So they were hiding their reactions more than the earlier cohort was. So the politics was still there, but I think they were kind of trying to suppress it to some degree. Like they didn't. And the student later told me, she's like, "I didn't want to see the thing interrupted. Like it wasn't important." So it was there, but their relationship to it, I thought, was different. The incident you're talking about with the Juba was a very strange one because I made some editing comments on a student's paper. His paper was about how it's necessary to have some level of censorship, which to me was not a very promising topic. And so I was probably a little blunter in some of my comments. But he made comments like he said, in any civilized country, you can't call for some part of it to become independent or whatever. And I said, no, you can't make that statement because this happens. I mean, they voted on it in Scotland, they voted on it in Canada, and you can talk about it in many places. So you have to change the way you're doing this, right? It's just very reasonable comments, but very direct. And then all of these things that were just on his paper somehow were posted on a bulletin board and online at Sichuan University as a description of like an argument in class, and that I had been sort of saying these things and kind of browbeating the students. And a lot of it was totally, the whole scene was fabricated and some of the details were fabricated, but I could tell it came from the student's paper. Yeah. So that was, and then then it went up on Weibo and other places, and so.
Yeah, the way that netizens run with these things really, I find, isn't representative of the whole national mood, because it really is kind of a minority online.
Yeah. No, I think that's true, but it's scary because things do happen, right? And when something like this, and I was nervous because we had not been there that long. We had just been settling in, and I didn't want to get kicked out. And the university was nervous. When I talked to the administrators in my department, they were nervous, and they didn't seem to want to pursue it. They didn't. From what I could tell, nobody talked to that student to see how did this go from here to there, and I didn't talk to him either until much later, because I just felt like, let's get past this.
That's sort of the tightened mood that you were alluding to as well. Just hearing you talk, it strikes me that maybe in the late 90s, there was more a sense of open possibility. China was still finding its feet as a modern nation and kind of figuring out what you can talk about, what you can't, which direction it was going to go in. And now it feels like China has figured that out, and people know what you can't talk about, and especially in this political climate. And there's almost a feeling of foreclosed possibilities and a sense of figuring out, what you could do and what you can't. What do you think?
Yeah, they're definitely, as I said, they were savvier. They knew the system. They also kind of knew that there's times when you don't need to push it. Just like I talk about that student who said, "No, don't bring up this China and Taiwan thing. Just let it go." So I think they were capable of making those decisions. At the same time, I talked about stuff in the classroom at Sichuan University that I never would have touched in fooling. A lot of things, and a lot of things that would have been sensitive. In the old days, like when I talked about the American election, that was not sensitive to talk about in Sichuan University. So I didn't have to be as careful, basically. And like debates were also very different. I wrote about in Rivertown, like it was very hard to have a debate because everybody had the same opinions, right? So the best thing to do in those days would be to debate about the United States. Like I'd say, should America have a one-child policy? And then the kids could argue. You'd have to kind of trick them in some way or kind of manipulate it a bit so that they would feel safe and talk. At Sichuan University, that wasn't necessary. Like we talked about, like, should the Gaokao system be radically reformed, or and they would have a really active, good debate about that. And we talked about other issues that would, in the old days, would have been hard to argue about, and students felt comfortable with that. So that kind of reflected this increased education level. I think increased awareness, better information. So in that sense, the classroom felt freer actually than it had. So there is a combination. You've kind of got both things going on.
Right. So you arrived in September 2019, and then I guess a little less than 5 months later, COVID hit, with the first kind of lockdowns happening at the end of January, and this is a COVID memoir in some ways. I remember those early days of COVID, just the sense of panic. And you describe the city lockdowns. You also go on a reporting trip to Wuhan. Can you tell us a little bit about living through those early days of COVID and how you felt that the nation's response and people's response, how was that indicative? What did that reveal about this new China?
Yeah, I think the bottom line is that it varied wildly, basically. And I just said in the book, there's basically like kind of 3 phases of China's COVID experience, and each of them with completely different outcomes, and your assessment of them totally. The first one, obviously in Wuhan, the cover-up and the whistleblowers who got basically arrested or threatened, or they had to sign statements and they were silenced. All of those things that went on in Wuhan that were awful in the first phase. sort of showed the lack of a free press. It showed, the problems with authority, and with officials just blatantly lying to people. And then they entered another phase where after that, all those initial missteps, it was handled quite well. I think it was appropriate to China, basically, in the sense that they had, and a lot of it was a matter of public health investment. They were willing to invest a lot in things like contact tracing, testing, trying to make tests available, and quarantine facilities and things like that, and that worked. And so that was kind of a long second phase when life felt quite normal. And that's when I went to Wuhan, for example, like August of 2020. In most parts of the world, you couldn't really, it was risky to travel, or in some places you couldn't travel. But I was going there, nobody's wearing masks, we're interviewing face to face. The disease wasn't moving, and at that point, I still didn't know anybody who had gotten it in China, and none of my students who were, those first 2 semesters, it was more than 100 students. None of them knew anybody. I would do surveys. And then the third phase was when they kept to this strategy too long. Post-Omicron, post-vaccine, you've got to change, obviously, and they didn't. And so each of those tells us something about both China's strengths and its weaknesses. So I think it's a really fascinating case study, also because it's unusual. Like the U.S. didn't do very well at the start and didn't do very well after that. The only thing we did well was the vaccines, basically. But in terms of public health policy, it was basically a failure. But it was pretty consistent, and most countries were like that. And something about China made it totally different, right? That you've got this huge failure, and then really what I'd say was a big success, and then a huge failure again. I think the first failure is more understandable because at the beginning of something like this, I think probably, and when I talked to disease specialists, they would say everybody was probably going to screw this up. But you're going to screw it up in your own way, right? So it tells us important things about China, because the way they screwed it up is different from the way we would have if it had started in New Orleans or something, like this kind of disease. But that, each of them tells you something, I think, important about it. But there wasn't any other example I could think of a large country that had such radically different scorecards on different parts of the pandemic.
Yeah, although other Asian nations followed the model of zero COVID, like Taiwan and Singapore, and successfully. Certainly that third phase in 2022 in China was very apparently, to me at least, that this was an overreaction and excessive and not good for the nation's health or economy or anything. But people do forget that for the majority of the pandemic, life was great in China. It was probably better than being in the States.
Yeah, that second section has been elided in the memory, basically. It doesn't. But you can see it in surveys. So I surveyed my students both from Fuling and from Chuanda, and it's interesting when I asked them to rate in 2023. I asked them, well, how would you rate China's government's performance in the pandemic? And the Fuling cohort, more than 30 students, it was quite high. It was over 8 on average, 8 out of 10. Whereas the students from Sichuan University was just a bit over 6, for more than 40 respondents, and strikingly different. And again, Fuling students are not in the biggest cities. A lot of the Sichuan University students are in Chengdu, some in Shanghai, and these bigger cities that had worse lockdowns. The Fuling students were mostly in, like Shenzhen, like kind of smaller cities where the lockdowns weren't as bad. They had government jobs, which they maintained, and so they didn't suffer the way that the young people who were worried about their job prospects. So that's interesting. Too, to me, is that the assessment of it feels quite, I think it's probably wildly different depending on who you were in China and where you were in China. I mean, you were in Dali, right? And so in a place like that, the third phase wasn't disastrous.
I missed the whole pandemic. It was, a rural place like that. We had, there was some QR code and face mask sort of theater, but otherwise it was pretty idyllic.
Yeah, but if you had been in Shanghai, you'd have a very different feeling. And so, I think there is this wildly different assessment probably. And it'd be interesting to see how it settles on people over time. Like, what does it mean toward their view of their country? And
a lot of people suffered in the pandemic. There was an article which came out, I think it was 2021, and I think it was partially in response to one of your New York articles about China's positively framed response to the pandemic from Jeremy Barmay, in which I think what he's essentially accusing you is soft peddling atrocities that are happening in China, human rights abuses and so on, Xinjiang, and by only focus on the society. What's your response to that?
Yeah, that was in 2020. I'd written 2 pandemic articles at that point. I'd written one about the first phase and I wrote about Wuhan and about Li Wenliang, the doctor, and communicating with a pharmacist there who was kind of on the front lines and was furious about the government mistakes. And I also described things like there had been a suicide of a kid in Fuling, sort of that I worried about I was noticing that there were problems with remote schooling, and so I wrote about that. And then the second story was about this second phase that was successful. So Barmé criticized my pandemic coverage without ever mentioning the first story. So if you're going to write about what I'm writing about the pandemic, and I've written two 8,000-word stories, you can't pretend that one doesn't exist. So, and he accused me of writing this way because I was afraid of trouble. I had already been to Wuhan and talked to Fang Fang. Like, if you were afraid of trouble, the last thing you want to do in August of 2020 is go to Wuhan and sit down across the table from Fang Fang,
Yeah.
So...
For sure, but as to the general criticism that in focusing on certain sort of social stories in a country like China, you're sort of ignoring larger things that are going on. What do you think of that?
But I wasn't. I mean, he's focusing on one story. I'm writing other stories.
Yeah.
He's pretending they don't exist. He's not asking me about it. If he had called me also, which is standard practice in journalism, ask the person for comment. Ask the person what's going on. Are you avoiding these topics? I would have said I was just in Wuhan. I just talked to Fang Fang. It's a story I'm working on right now.
Yeah.
So, believe me, like I've written 5 books about China, dozens of stories in the New Yorker. If you're going to pick one story, and I mean, he accused me of being like a Stalinist-style apologist. If you're going to pick one story and try to make that claim, I think it doesn't hold up. You have to look at a person's body of work. And to me, it says more about the mood of China commentary at this time. There's a lot of anger. There's a lot of frustration. I understand that, China has not turned out the way that a lot of people wanted it to. And you can beat your head against the CCP, and you're not going to get any reaction. But if you go after me, it might be more satisfying.
So you were informed in spring 2021 that Sichuan University wasn't going to renew your contract for a third year. And that was delivered to you in these very kind of curt bureaucratic terms. And you've written on this before, and as have other people, but you don't sort of really get into it too much in the book. Sort of how have you processed that now, and what's your understanding of what happened, or is this pure speculation? Does it tie into the political mood, or was it just a...
I have a pretty good idea what happened, but I don't know for sure. But I mean, my job was not renewed. And the reasons I was given kind of changed at different times. But the decision was made by a dean, at the University of Pittsburgh, who was, the dean of this program, a joint program in China. And he actually was not in China at the time and had not been in China since the start of the pandemic. And my view is that he read this situation as problematic, that I was writing stories that were getting criticized, because I was attacked by people on both sides. And some people like Barmé had pointed out that I wasn't on a journalist visa, which to me is not something you should ever do when somebody's in China and working. It's not your place when you're in New Zealand or Australia to try to get somebody in trouble. And so that, my read is that, well, from what I can tell, the dean, I think, was worried about problems and preemptively decided that just it would be easier if I was gone. I don't think he did a very good job of checking with, and I'm sure it was not a top-down decision. I'm really certain of that from people I've talked to, that it wasn't like somebody in the top of the university or the province told him to do this. But this is what happens in this kind of environment: is people are scared, and they make preemptive decisions, right? It's why I didn't teach in Fuling in the first place. Was that when the Fuling College wanted to hire me, but somebody in the bureaucracy in Chongqing made, now I was told this is because of a general nervousness in the post-Bolshevik stuff, that they just don't want to take risks. And it's totally natural, right? You understand how people do this. I was less sympathetic because it was an American who was doing this, and I don't think he had to.
Right.
And then there was a bit of a backlash. Some number of students weren't happy about it. A number of Chinese readers and people said this. Why is this necessary? And so I think it was kind of an unfortunate thing, but there was nothing I could do about it. And I know that the university kind of backtracked, because toward the end of my time, somebody from the Weiban set up a meeting with me, and this is like days before my daughters and my wife were leaving, and we'd already moved her stuff out and so on, and said, oh, by the way, we'd like to have you find a way to stay or something, you know. But by that point, there had been so much sort of lost trust through this that I wasn't going to consider it. And, you know, in that situation, when it's gotten to that point, it feels pretty risky as a writer. Like, what happens if these people change their mind, or, you know, if Xi Jinping says something about some random thing and that becomes a target.
Right.
You know, who knows?
It's better to go.
So it was easy at that point. And I tried 3 times with the dean of my program and asked, including the last time I said I'm willing to sign a long-term contract, because one of the reasons he said is, oh, you're not on a long-term contract, and that might be a problem for the employment law. And I said, well, let's do a long-term contract then. You know, and never was I offered any chance to stay.
So now we're in this situation, you personally, but all of us as well, where there's just fewer journalists there in China, especially after so many American journalists were expelled in 2020, and a lot of China watching is being done from outside. You know, we compile all these lists of all these China books, and you know the majority of them are written from people outside of China in the English language. Do you think that you can watch and write about China from outside? What is lost?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously you can and you should, and we have to, right? I mean, we need people doing whatever they can, and there's China people like you and me who try to stay in touch with people there. There's enormous numbers of Chinese who in a perfect world would be journalists in China, you know, who are now in America or Britain or other countries doing what they can to follow what's going on and to analyze and to write. And so, you know, it's important, like we need it. But at the same time, you definitely miss a lot, you know. And one problem is that I think that kind of reporting tends to skew elite. The farther you are away, the more likely your interlocutors are, I think, to be elite. And you know, that's one difference. That's one reason why I've really worked hard to stay in touch with the people I taught in Fuling, because they aren't as elite, and they often are in places that are not as much driven by, you know, they're not in Beijing or Chengdu, or they're in smaller places. And so I think it's useful to hear from them. But generally speaking, it's harder to be in touch with people in these smaller places when you're from afar. Yeah. And of course, the internet in China is not representative. Just like it's not representative of the United States either. Yeah. So you really need people on the ground, and it's a crisis. You know, like, because that texture of life, all the details, and the things that also make it more human. You need to be on the ground. I don't know what the solution is, because you know it's hard for journalists to get a visa there now. You know, if you're an American citizen. I mean, I think we need to find ways to get more students there. You know, Americans studying Chinese, and you know, those numbers are sort of frighteningly low. But yeah, no, I mean, in terms of writing, it's you know, it makes me sad, because when I talk about how things were wide open for my students, and they were wide open for me. You know, I mean, I was a beneficiary of this environment. You know, when I showed up in 1996. It was possible to live in a town like Fuling and learn Chinese and make real connections with people. And then it was possible to go to Beijing and set up as a freelancer and kind of make my way as a writer. And I was able to feel it out and find the type of stories and topics that interested me and you know, carve out my niche. And if I were doing that now, I don't think it was really possible.
Yeah, I also worried that China writing has become dehumanized a little bit. It's become an abstraction, and very understandably, the further away you are, the wider your lens is, but we're missing that kind of granular human level story, which just remind us that it's a country populated of individuals with, you know, funny, hilarious stories and ambitions and struggles and so on, which your writing captures so well. And then just as a last question, as a sort of second half of this question, you were teaching nonfiction writing to Chinese students. You opened the book with a quote from one of your students, who writes on the topic of writing, quote, "Nonfiction description has disappeared in China. I don't know how to express facts in words now. I have a hard time writing what I want to write because I am afraid what I will write will probably be deleted," end quote. And you mentioned some student publications, but just in general, what's your feeling about how possible it is for Chinese citizens, whether in the diaspora or in Chinese media and other publications, to be telling these stories, which obviously would be the best scenario, rather than having journalists?
Yeah. I mean, you know, I taught amazing students in my journalism class, but very few of them planned to be journalists. You know, actually, very few of them were from the journalism department at Sichuan University. It was mostly, English majors and some engineers, even like a kid in physics. I mean, it was people from other departments, and they were doing it because they were interested. But in only a few exceptions, do I have students from those classes who want to be journalists. So, and even the people in the J school there saw their prospects as very limited. And I have a few who've gone into the Chinese state media system, and they're, it's hard. It's not that satisfying. They're trying to do their work they care about as much as they can on the side or whatever.
Simply because they can't write what they want to?
Yeah, you can't do, it was much more open 10 years ago. I mean, there was a lot of dynamic journalism in China actually for a period. It was never like you could do in the West, but it was good. You could do some things and people were pushing. It's not that way now. I mean, I have one very dynamic student who's in Africa and just looking to write a book, instead of being, not with a news service. And, I kind of encourage her that there might be a way to do it now, just have an interesting experience, write about this place. And when you're away from China, maybe it's also, she's writing about Chinese people in Africa, but maybe that's a nice way to kind of not have this weight on you all the time. But yeah, it's hard, as I say, it's depressing to think about what it'd be like for a young foreigner like me going there and trying to get established now. It's much harder to think about young Chinese who are who are talented and people would always say to me, you write these books and people in China, we can't do this, or people sometimes say that, and it's like there's all the talent in the world is there, right? There's highly literate people, highly observant people. They just don't have the avenues. Like that's not what creates. It's not like my personality creates me as a writer. It's the infrastructure, the education I received, the institutions like the New Yorker that supported me, and that's what makes it happen. It doesn't come from me. It comes from everything around me, and unfortunately, that's really hard to do in China.
Right, the ambition and the talent is there, but not the kind of structures.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great place in terms of it's a highly literate population. Like if you could write stuff and people care about it, they would read it. They would pay to read it, and you've got a big market. Yeah. But you don't have the it's just not possible. Political reasons. There are also economic issues, right? I mean, it's hard for a young Chinese person to make a living at it.
So what does this mean for the China book?
It's hard. It's a hard time. I mean, I think we had there was sort of an amazing era, I feel like, in the 2000s and early 2010s when you just had all kinds of different books coming out around China. And I think that's not the case right now. It's hard. It's just in those days you had so many more people there on the ground, and they would find different angles and different types of people were writing the books, different perspectives. That's really what you need. And it's narrowing, and it's becoming more political. It's more security focused. We're losing the human element. I mean, I really hope it changes, obviously. But for me, it's probably not in my near future because my kids are entering high school, and we had always planned to be in the U.S. for this period. So I'll be writing about other things I expect in the next few years.
Well, even if it's one of the last ones, this is a great China book. Everyone should go out and buy it. Peter Hessler, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thanks so much. I appreciate it.